Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Astronomy 103. I'm trying something different, so this time you can see my face rather than just stare at my PowerPoints. We're going to start to look at classifying stars so that we can learn more about them. So far, we've been kind of talking about star properties abstractly, like this is the temperature, this is the luminosity, this is the color. But we want to start to fit these into a bigger picture. What does it all mean? So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about stars, and we're going to talk about how we classify them. So this is called spectral types. So our objectives are we're going to name the spectral types of the stars and sort them by temperature. The system is based on the star's temperature. And we're also going to look at another classification system of stars from their spectra called luminosity classes, which tell us the luminosity. And that's going to give us some hints on how we can find distance to stars where we don't have a parallax. We're also going to start to introduce an idea we're going to come to on Friday, on next lecture, starting to find the patterns of all of this stuff. So not today. We'll get to a little bit of that and then we'll finish it on Friday. So, all right, let's start. All stars are mostly hydrogen and helium. We've worked that out from the work of Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin. But all stars do not look like they're made of the same stuff, which was what kept us from figuring this out. So here is a plot of here's a picture of a number of stars arranged from hottest to coldest, hottest at the top, coldest at the bottom. And the hydrogen lines are labeled. And you can see, well, first you can see that the hot stars are blue and the cold stars are red. I've shown you this picture before. The hot stars are much brighter in the blue than the red, and the cold stars are much brighter in the red than the blue. And I'm using cold as a relative term, these are still several thousand degrees Kelvin. But let's look at the labeled lines, the hydrogen alpha, beta, and gamma. And you can see that the hot stars, they kind of have lines, hydrogen lines. They get much brighter for kind of, stars labeled B and A on this picture. They get fainter. But I just said all of these stars are made of mostly hydrogen. So what gives? And this is this complicated trying to classify stars because we were trying to figure out something that made some degree of useful sense. We can classify stars by the number of letters in their name. That's just not very useful. The first astronomers were like, let's just look at the strength of the hydrogen line. So we'll call a star an A star if it's got a really strong hydrogen line, and an O or an M if it's got a really weak one. In, alphabetical order. But what astronomers noticed, and what in particular one astronomer, Annie Jump Cannon, started to notice is that there was kind of a trend, but it wasn't A, B, C, D, E, F, G, etc. Which was, if you arrange the stars by color, which now we know is a temperature proxy, you go from O to B, to A, to F, to G, to K, to M. That the bluest stars, the hottest stars, don't have very strong hydrogen. The pretty hot, but not the hottest stars have really strong hydrogen absorption. And then it gets weaker as the stars get cooler and cooler, or as they get redder and redder. So Annie Jump Cannon rearranged the system. She tossed out some categories they didn't particularly need. They didn't need all the letters, and some of them were useful for calling out weird stars. And then she came up with the system we still use today of spectral types. You sometimes hear this called the Harvard system because Cannon and her colleagues were working out of Harvard under William Pickering. They had a massive number of photographic plates of spectra, and Pickering had hired a bunch of women to basically go through them and catalog them. So the system is OBAFGKM. Now this is a little confusing because it's not as nice to memorize as say ABCDEFG, but you can remember it as O but and F grade kills me. And there's a few other mnemonics you can find out there. So this sorts stars by temperature. O stars are hot, M stars are cool, O stars are blue, M stars are red. And it wasn't until later that, so astronomers and physicists like Magnat Zaha and then Cecilia Payne-Gaposchkin figured out that what we were looking at is just the temperature effect, that the difference between stars is firstly mostly just the fact that hot stars are hot and cold stars are cool. All stars are hydrogen and helium with a little bit of extra. It's just that at the right temperature, hydrogen does a lot of absorption in the visible, and at the wrong temperature, it doesn't. That's the spectral type system. O, B, A, F, G, K, M. So a second system was also being kind of constructed at the Yerkes Observatory. And they noticed that not all stars of the same color, of the same spectral type, did look the same. You know, all M stars had certain traits in common. That's how we could classify them as M stars versus O stars versus A stars versus G stars. But certain stars had broader lines and certain stars had narrower lines. And what we later learned is, just like we later figured out that which lines we saw told us the star's temperature, how broad the lines were in a given spectral type at a given temperature at a different given color, was a measure of how big the star was. So we could measure the width of these lines, and we gave them a Roman numeral 1 through 5. And when we were later able to measure the size, the luminosity of these stars, we discovered that the class 1 stars were all the big, giant, bright, luminous stars. And the class 5 stars were the smaller ones. So these numbers, Roman numerals 1 through 5, is what we call luminosity class. And we're going to talk more about, all right, so let's put this together. Our sun is a spectral type G star, and its luminosity class is 5, which is what we call a main sequence star. So let's focus on those for a bit. Because most stars are main sequence stars. Most stars are class 5. So what we're going to do is, let's take all the stars we know their parallax of. And we can get, if we know their parallax and we know their apparent brightness, we can measure the luminosity. We can also get their spectral type, which tells us the temperature. So we're going to make a graph. Astronomers love making graphs. So at the bottom, we're plotting temperature, and we're plotting it kind of backwards because we measure this by color, and we wanted blue to be on the left and red to be on the right. And along the side, we have the luminosity. And most of those class 5 stars, we're only going to plot those, fall on that kind of colored band in the picture. We named it the main sequence. Now, this sort of diagram is what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about on Friday. We call it a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram, or an HR diagram, after the folks who did it. And again, if all the class 5 stars, all the luminosity class 5 stars fall on this trend, the O5 stars, type O class 5, are all relatively bright. The M5 stars are all relatively dim. And they follow this nice trend that we named the main sequence. You know, they're not randomly scattered. So that means, what that means is, if we know, and we did this with stars we all knew the luminosities of because we know their parallax and how apparently bright they are. That means if we know a star is on the main sequence, if it's, you know, a class 5 star, if we know its temperature, we know how bright it should be. And that means if we know how bright it should be, and we know how bright it looks from Earth, we know how far away it is. That's great. We've discovered a method to find distances that does not depend on parallax, which is good because parallax is limited to only kind of our nearby region. We're basically comparing nearby stars where we know the luminosity independent of pretty much anything else to distant stars where we don't. So as a result, we call this spectroscopic parallax. We're using a star's spectra to compare it to nearby stars that do have parallax measurements. It's not actually the same, it's not actually parallax, it's just using both spectra and parallax to get the distance of a star. Now for individual stars, this method has a lot of error. You know, if we can get the distance another way, it's usually better. But if you have a group of stars, like the one in my background image, you can assume all those stars are about the same distance from Earth. They're what we call a star cluster. Well, in that case, you measure as many of those stars that are on the main sequence as you can, calculate their distance based on spectroscopic parallax, and then you know the distance to that group of stars, that cluster of stars. There you go. So in summary, we have the spectral types of stars, O, B, A, F, G, K, M. We also have this luminosity class, where 1 are the brightest supergiant stars to 5, which are the fainter main sequence stars. The main sequence stars are the most common stars in our galaxy, our neighborhood, all kinds of stuff. And we call them the main sequence because they form a nice line if you plot luminosity versus their temperature versus their spectral type. So if you know their spectral type, you know their luminosity. All you need to know is they're on the main sequence. And this is a less accurate method to get distance and geometric parallax, but it's still pretty useful. Especially if you have multiple stars you can kind of combine. So next time, we're going to look more at the HR diagram. I said most stars are on the main sequence, but what about those other sorts? And we're also going to talk a little bit about, okay, does O, B, A, F, G, K, M cover everything?